Hi, everyone. We're back at 11 o'clock, so we're going to get going again with our next speaker. Our next speaker is here. He's ready to go. It's Jared Rozeboom. Take it away, Jared.
All right, just share my screen here a second. Oh, here we are. There we go. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. So good morning, everyone. Really thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us here today. So my name is Jared Rozeboom, and I work as a fire service specialist with the Minnesota State Fire Marshal Division. And so today we're going to talk about understanding your fire department. I know there's a lot of townships that either contract with the local municipality to provide fire protection services for their township, or they also own their own fire department, or they're part of a joint powers agreement that manages that fire department. So some of our objectives, just a quick overview of our objectives for today. We're going to look at some of the guiding principles of the fire service, or some of the things, organizations that impact how fire departments operate. So each of these creates kind of benchmarks that help fire departments develop, policies and procedures for their department, and looking at standard operating procedures or guidelines. Some of these will help set benchmarks for vehicles and equipment, and help the fire department develop training programs that promote firefighter safety. And some of these will also encourage fire departments to provide the best service possible for their communities. And so, as you can see, some of these are national organizations that cover a very vast and broad set of standards, like the NFPA, ISO, OSHA, and some of these organizations or standards are also more local level at the state level, to provide more specific guidance. So looking at some of the state statutes, and looking at OSHA and MIN-OSHA. So some of these organizations provide standards and guidelines that are voluntary and some that are mandatory. And we'll go over a little bit of each of those a little later in the presentation here. We're also going to look at fire department leadership. Who is your fire chief? We'll talk a little bit about, who they are, what their responsibilities are with the fire department, and maybe there's some similarities between you as township board members and the local fire chief. We'll also take a brief look at some of the fire department's budgeting process, what's included in the budget, how they come up with those numbers, and we'll touch briefly on some of the fire protection contracts that we've seen. So let's just jump right into this and look at how the NFPA impacts fire departments. So the NFPA, or the National Fire Protection Association, is an international organization that creates consensus codes and standards that impact everything, not just in the fire service, but looking at building codes, electrical codes, fuel delivery systems. There's a vast array of standards that the NFPA creates. So the NFPA has well over 300 specific standards that address, that wide range of topics. But the overall main goal of the NFPA in creating those standards is to create that guiding document to promote an increased level of safety. And so all 300 plus NFPA standards are available to read for free at nfpa.org. So on their website, you can find those standards. The NFPA standards are reviewed every 5 years, and they will make revisions to those at that time. So this helps to keep them current, with the latest information, current research, so, and also a thing during that review process, there's a public comment period that allows members of the public to provide comments, input, and feedback on that standard. So if there's things, that they want to see changed in there, you can provide that information and input back to the NFPA committees. So the NFPA standards are voluntary. There's no such thing as NFPA police. However, they are recognized as an industry best practice. So should a fire department wind up in court, with litigation, those standards can become, in essence, a legal standard. So it's fairly simple for an attorney to make a case with an NFPA standard. So just an example, if there's a firefighter that winds up getting injured on the job, and it winds up in litigation, an attorney can bring a fire chief into the court, and just ask him a simple question, that says, NFPA standard 1852 requires that, your SCBAs or your air packs are tested at least annually. So chief, can you tell me when's the last time that your SCBAs were tested in accordance with this standard? And the fire chief might go, well, gee, I guess it's been a couple, 3 years. And the attorney can just say, that NFPA standards, is created to guide fire departments, in the care and maintenance of their SCBAs to make sure that they're operationally functional and that things like this don't happen. And, chief, fire departments all over the country can, they follow this standard. So, maybe can you tell me what makes your fire department special that, they don't have to follow this? So these can become a legal standard, in a court of law and through litigation. So these NFPA standards can also become mandatory if, federal or state OSHA incorporated into their regulations, and then it becomes mandatory, and mandatory is just that. It needs to be followed. So the standard's no longer voluntary and is now enforceable, albeit through another agency, not the NFPA, but another agency. So what role exactly does the NFPA play in the purchase of apparatus and equipment? So again, all the NFPA standards are developed and reviewed by committees. So the committees are made up of various stakeholders, from the fire service. So we're looking at, there's fire chiefs, there's firefighters, people who are in the actual fire service that are on these committees. There's also manufacturers or vendors that are part of these committees, people who build the equipment that fire departments use, whether that's fire trucks or extrication tools, hoses, nozzles. They're all can be a part of these committees. Other government agencies such as OSHA, the National Transportation Safety Board, other government agencies can be on here, as well as educational institutions, as they do a lot of the research and stuff that goes into developing a lot of these standards. So as a committee, these members develop and they review and they revise these standards with industry best practices and safety in mind. So an example of how they review these things, fire truck manufacturers or apparatus manufacturers are now required to install a seatbelt warning indicator for the driver of all apparatus that are manufactured. And this just simply indicates that there's a firefighter sitting somewhere in that cab that is not wearing their seatbelt. And so this standard was revised due to the number of firefighters that have been injured or killed when they were involved in an apparatus accident or a motor vehicle accident. And so as that committee over the years have done research, and looked at, how do we make these fire trucks safer? They recognize that adding that additional layer of safety to these trucks, is going to improve the safety of firefighters overall for everybody. So some of the topics or areas, are covered by multiple standards, yet each one is uniquely different. A good example of this is going to be NFPA standards 1971. This covers the design and the construction requirements for firefighter turnout gear. So this sets the criteria for the types of materials or fabrics that they should be using, how that fabric and material is sewn together, how it's constructed, and what types of certain tests that it must pass to be compliant with the standard. So the 1971 standard applies strictly to manufacturers of this firefighters turnout gear, but it can also be referenced by fire departments to make sure that the turnout gear that they're purchasing is compliant and meets the standard. When we look at 1851, this covers the care, maintenance, and retirement of this turnout gear. So the manufacturers, aren't really required to do anything with this standard besides developing some recommendations for the end users or the fire departments on how to clean, maintain, inspect, their turnout gear. So the fire department uses this standard to determine how they're going to inspect, how they're going to clean, how they're going to maintain their turnout gear. Manufacturers may have more stringent requirements, for the proper care and maintenance of the turnout gear that they manufacture, but they at least need to meet the minimum requirements set forth in 1851. And so again, 1971 is pretty much for the manufacturers or who is making the turnout gear, and 1851 is set out for fire department guideline compliance. And so we talk a little bit about OSHA in here. OSHA uses the general duty clause to adopt 1851, for that care, maintenance, and retirement. So if you read into 1851, it states that all turnout gear must be retired from emergency service 10 years from the date of manufacture. So OSHA's general duty clause states, that an employer has a duty to develop a feasible and effective method to correct a recognized hazard. So with NFPA standard 1851 stating, that after 10 years, this turnout gear needs to be replaced. So OSHA's position through that general duty clause is that fire departments should recognize the 10-year life cycle as a hazard, and they should be developing a plan on the replacement of that turnout gear after that 10-year period. But we'll talk a little bit more in depth on OSHA here in just a few more slides. So what about apparatus and equipment? It's kind of the same thing as the PPE that we just talked about. There's two different standards that cover the same topic. One pertains to the manufacturers, and then there's another one that pertains to the fire departments. So looking at 1901, this is the manufacturer's guideline to be compliant with how they design the trucks, how it's constructed, what materials they use, and what testing requirements it has to pass. 1911, again, is the fire department's guideline to be compliant. And 1911 is one of those standards that we receive a lot of questions about, and specifically in regards to the retirement age of apparatus. So in NFPA 1911, it does not have a mandatory retirement age for fire trucks. And so that misconception comes from the Annex D.1 that's found at the end of the standard. Because at the beginning of Annex D.1, there's a simple statement that's often overlooked. And that simple statement says that this annex is not a part of the requirements for this NFPA document, but is included for informational purposes only. And so in that annex, the committee has written a few paragraphs in there about, age of apparatus and, what they perceive as a retirement age for that. And they simply state in there that, we understand that there are apparatus, out there that are simply worn out after 7 or 8 years of service. But we also understand that there's apparatus out there that are 20 plus years old and still in good serviceable and workable condition. So they want this left in local control as to, local control needs to determine when that piece of equipment or that apparatus needs to be retired from service. And so if you look in this standard, there's inspection, maintenance, and testing requirements there. So there's criteria in there for inspection and out of service criteria that probably serves as a better example of when that piece of apparatus should be retired from service. Let's talk a little bit about ISO, or the Insurance Services Office. So ISO provides what's called a public protection classification rating. So ISO bases that rating on 4 different factors, and local insurance companies use that rating to determine property insurance premiums for commercial buildings as well as private residences. So those 4 areas, they're looking at emergency communications. So they're going to work with, the local dispatch centers and look at what type of equipment they have in there. You know, is their 911 system up to date? Are they able to send an alert or a message or a page to the local fire departments to notify them of an emergency? They're also going to look at the fire department on the emergency communications part to make sure that they're able to receive that communication from the dispatch center to notify them of an incident or a fire or an emergency. Water supply, they're going to look at, you know, what's the location of the water supply, you know, is it readily available? What's the flow, or how much is the water supply? You know, and if they're looking at a municipality, they're going to want to see some documentation that, you know, the fire hydrants have been tested, you know, on an annual basis. Looking at community risk reduction, that's simply fire prevention programs. You know, is the fire department involved in fire prevention programs within the community, or is there another organization doing the fire prevention programs? You know, but there's some points that can be had with fire prevention programs. And then they take a deeper dive into the fire department. You know, they're going to want to see documentation and proof, you know, that the fire department's been doing regular pump testing, hose testing, you know, and all the other equipment testing. They're going to want to make sure that all the apparatus that the fire department have are equipped per NFPA 1901 standard. The standard has in there, you know, what should be on these trucks, you know, before they roll out the door, you know, when we're looking at axes, pipe poles, hose nozzles, you know, things of that nature. They're going to take a deep dive into training records for the department. You know, they're going to want to see what type of training they've been doing for their department, how many hours of training they've been doing, and making sure that everybody on the department has been receiving those hours and that type of training. You know, and lastly, they're going to look at, you know, what type of people are on the department, meaning are they career, are they part-time, paid on call, or are they all volunteer? You know, and then the number of people that are on the department. And so again, ISO looks at all of this stuff to determine, you know, basically what your residents are going to be paying for property insurance premiums. We'll talk a little bit about Minnesota OSHA. So OSHA, as we all know, is a federal agency as well as a state agency in Minnesota. So MinOSHA was written into state statute. Was created through a state statute, and basically this same state statute gives them the authority to enforce health and safety standards for employers and employees within Minnesota. So how this relates to fire departments, the fire department is the employer, or that, you know, municipality or the township is the employer, and the firefighters that are working with that department, whether they're volunteer or paid on call or career, they are considered the employees. So, you know, Minnesota is known as an OSHA state because of this. So what that means is, you know, MinOSHA has the authority to enforce federal OSHA regulations, as well as adopt and enforce regulations that may be a little more stringent than the federal regulations. So again, where does, you know, how does MinOSHA gain the authority to enforce NFPA standards? You know, and again, and that comes through the general duty clause. You know, general duty clause requires that employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. So the key word there is recognized. So again, when NFPA creates a standard, you know, such as NFPA 1851, which is on the turnout gear, the firefighter turnout gear, you know, they expect the fire department to follow that standard as it relates to employee safety. You know, so we talked about that turnout gear needing to be replaced within that 10 years from the date of manufacture. You know, the NFPA standard committee that created that, through a lot of extensive research over a number of years and testing of this turnout gear, it's been proven time and time again that after 10 years, there's a serious drop off in the level of protection that that turnout gear provides to firefighters. And so that's where that 10-year cutoff date came from with that. You know, so the committee recognized that, you know, that stuff degrades over time and it doesn't provide the level of protection for the employee that's wearing it, you know, to a point where it doesn't protect them as well anymore. And so Mid-OSHA, through the general duty clause, expects fire departments to recognize that as a hazard. And they expect the fire departments to have a plan in place to correct that hazard, to ensure that they are providing the proper personal protective equipment, turnout gear to the employees on that fire department. And so we worked with Mid-OSHA to come up with, what are the top things that they see when they visit with a fire department? If they get called in to do an inspection or things of that nature. So we worked with them to kind of create this list here, but we're just going to go through this list real quick here. One of them is, conditions of employment. Fire departments have a general duty to provide their firefighters with the proper personal protective equipment and other necessary equipment to do their job and to do their job safely. Right to know program, which is a written program that includes, what the initial training is, as well as annual refresher training. That covers all the hazards that are associated with firefighting, whether that's dealing with chemicals, noise, heat, things of that nature. Hazard communication program, again, needs to be a written initial and annual refresher training requirements, things that cover safety data sheets, container labels, and this is basically training somebody, showing them how to get information off of those safety data sheets and those container labels. Bloodborne pathogens, again, another written program with initial annual training requirements. It covers all the bloodborne pathogens, diseases, and what methods can they take to control exposures to those bloodborne pathogens. Annual monthly equipment inspections to include, personal protective equipment, but it needs to be a written and maintained records of that. Respiratory protection program. So again, a written program that outlines what the initial training is and annual training requirements for, wearing SCBAs, N95 respirators, and doing annual fit testing to make sure that they're wearing the right respirator to give them the proper respiratory protection. Fall protection, any platform that's 4 feet or more above the ground has to have some sort of a railing on there to prevent people from falling off of that. So we look in some fire stations, we see there's always some mezzanine where they're storing extra equipment or, supplies and stuff, but making sure there's a railing up there. Eye flush stations. Eye flush stations are required if you have a battery charger in the station, to where, you can charge a battery on a vehicle. You're required to have an eye flush station in there. And the eye flush stations must supply a minimum of 15 minutes flushing time, that can be operated solely by the individual. It doesn't require outside assistance. Procedures for response to hazardous substance release. This basically covers what is the department's plan when they respond to a hazardous material incident. Some things to consider, would be, what's the department's hazmat training level? Is it something that they can handle? If the department can't handle the hazardous material released, who can? Who do they contact? How do they contact? And this basically is ensuring, from OSHA's standpoint, this is ensuring that the department has a standard operating procedure, a guideline for responding to that hazmat incident, to make sure that, their firefighters aren't rushing into this thing in over their head and we wind up getting somebody hurt. Overhead door openers that need to be equipped with, some kind of a self-reversing switch. Whether that's the rubber strip on the bottom of the door that senses, when the door is closing on something, or the electronic eyes, that tell when somebody is blocking that doorway or walks through that doorway, the door needs to automatically reverse. Grounding of equipment. A lot of this is, the grounding pin on extension cords that are typically missing, or they're broken off because, the fire station or, whatever they're plugging it into doesn't have the ground pin. It's only got the 2 pins in there for plugging in an extension cord. Switchboards with exposed parts. The most common violation they see with that is, an open slot in a circuit breaker panel. Also included in that, is broken outlet or light switch covers. Compressed air for cleaning. We all use compressed air for cleaning, but what OSHA wants to see is making sure that that pressure that comes out of that blower is less than 30 PSI. Exit signs, making sure they're clearly visible, marked emergency exit lighting are all optional or operational. Flexible cords, they can't be used in place of permanent wiring. There's some places that they've gone into and seen, that they had an extension cord that was zip tied to some conduit, and it was running over here and it was plugging in, a fluorescent light above a workbench. That's some of the things that they want to see eliminated in the fire stations. So we'll talk a little bit about HIPAA. HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And it's a federal law that was enacted back in 1996. So HIPAA was created as a national standard to protect sensitive patient information when that data is transmitted electronically. And so over the years, we think back, 30, 40 years ago, it was a lot of smaller independent hospitals. Today we've seen a lot of those hospitals have consolidated, so we're seeing bigger healthcare systems, and not just, the hospitals themselves, but also health insurance companies and pharmacies. So with the rise in that, there needed to be a standard on how to best share information between those hospitals, the insurance companies, and the pharmacies, because everybody had a different way of sharing that information. So that is what HIPAA created was, how to transmit this data electronically and make sure that it is secure when it is transmitted. So in Minnesota, we have what's called the Minnesota Health Records Act. So this was enacted back in 2007, and it is more stringent than what HIPAA is. So the Minnesota Health Records Act regulates the use and disclosure of all health records in Minnesota and provides additional protection for medical patients in Minnesota. So this Health Records Act regulates who you can share that patient information with and who you cannot share that information with. Oftentimes any disclosure of that information requires a signature from the patient or their legal guardian. So think back to the last time you went to the doctor, and you got referred to a specialist. More times than not, you signed a piece of paper that gave your doctor permission to share your medical information with the specialist or whoever you were getting referred to in there. Another good example of this is, over the last summer with COVID, some of the COVID positive cases, where these people were living, their addresses were shared with dispatch centers. And it was a great idea because it really helped improve situational awareness for fire, EMS, and law enforcement, but it gave them a little situational awareness that they were responding to an address with a known COVID positive case. However, what we had found out was, some patients refused to sign that disclosure and that release form. And not that that's a bad thing, because every patient has the right through the Health Records Act to protect their information and their identity. But again, this is just a little more stringent than what the HIPAA is. So really, where do fire departments, how is this guiding fire departments, and what they do? So fire departments basically are creating a health record anytime that they record a patient's identifiable information. So name, address, phone number, medical condition, any treatments or care that they provided. That becomes a health record that is, under the Minnesota Health Records Act. And so they have to be very careful on, how they treat that information and who that is disclosed to. So we'll take a look at some other state statutes and how they affect fire departments. So State Statute 299F covers, some fire investigations and some fire reporting, but any fire that causes more than $100 in damage, or any and all fires with an unknown origin are required to be reported. And so an investigation into those fires is required to determine, if it was a result of, was it just a carelessness? Was it an accident? Was there a design flaw with a piece of equipment? Or was it intentional? The statute also specifies in there that the investigation must begin within 2 days of the fire occurring. And at the State Fire Marshal Division, we have a very robust team of investigators that can assist with the local fire chief into the investigation into these fires. The other thing that's required, if there's a fatality involved with that fire, that is in the statute also, that is required to be investigated by our investigators with the State Fire Marshal Division. Also, in statute 299F, again, all fires that cause more than $100 in damage, or any fires unknown origin, required to be reported. State Fire Marshal Division, we provide an online reporting system for all the fire departments in the state, completely free of charge. So, we work with a lot of the fire departments, answering some questions, about, how do we report this and what's the best way to report that? But again, it's a free online reporting system that's available to all the fire departments in the state. So we'll talk a little bit about the state fire code. So also in 299F, the state fire code is written in the statute that, it's applicable throughout the entire state in all the political subdivisions, municipalities, so basically that means that even if your township doesn't adopt the fire code, to make it official within your township, the state fire code still applies and must be complied with. So that kind of leads into the other question, well, who enforces the state fire code in our community? Well, in the state fire code designates the local fire chief as the local fire code official, unless the fire chief or the local governing body designates someone else to do so. So again, we don't expect the local fire chief, to be an expert on the state fire code. So we have a code team within our office that can assist the local fire chief with interpreting that code. And a great example of that has been over the last year, with a lot of the COVID restrictions, and specifically with the bars and restaurants. We've seen that, through the governor's executive order, that he limited occupancy, to 25 or 50%, of the rated occupancy. Well, how do we know where's that rated occupancy? How do we figure that out? Well, that is found in the state fire code. And so we had gotten a lot of questions from fire chiefs going, I need some help here. How do we, I got a business that's asking, how many people they can have in there and still be within the governor's executive order. And so we worked with them to get them that information through the state fire code. And again, the fire chief was the one that had to go to the local business, do the measurements and do the calculations, but we gave them the steps to help them out with that. So again, we don't have the staffing nor the budget to come down to every community, to do a lot of this stuff with the state fire code. So it's written in the state fire code that the fire chief is that code official. So what about townships, that contract with the municipality to provide that fire protection? Who's in charge of the fire code there? So for townships that contract for fire protection services, again, the local fire chief is their fire code official, unless the township designates someone else to do so. So the fire chief decides, that maybe there's somebody else within the department that's better suited to do those code questions, code enforcement. He or she can designate that person to do the code enforcement. Or if the city government decides that, they have a building inspector that probably would be better suited for that, the city can do that. And the same thing with the township. If the township wants someone else from the township to, enforce the state fire code, they can do that. But again, it should be in writing somewhere in the contracts. That way there is no confusion over who is responsible for that and who needs to be, following through with some of those questions that might come in from homeowners or businesses. So we've talked a little bit about the fire chief, so maybe we should look at who is the fire chief. So, who your fire chief is going to depend on the type of fire department that's serving your community. If that fire department is career or if they're a combination department, are they paid on call or volunteer? So the vast majority of the fire departments in Minnesota are paid on call or volunteer. So some of those fire chiefs are going to receive, a yearly salary or a yearly stipend, and the amounts of that's going to vary from department to department. Could be, 10, 15, $20,000, it could be as little as $100. I know of a few fire chiefs that receive absolutely zero for being the chief of their department and being responsible for all of this stuff. But I think the biggest thing to remember, for these fire departments is that, being the fire chief is not their full-time job. In a lot of ways, they're just like you as township board members. Being on the township board isn't your full-time job, but being on that board, being that township board member, comes with a great responsibility and it comes with great accountability. And so the local fire chief is pretty much in the same position as you are. Being the chief's not their full-time job, but great responsibility and great accountability that comes along with that. So what does the fire chief actually oversee? They oversee all aspects in the operation of the fire department. From supervising incident operations, they're the ones in charge, on the scene of a fire or motor vehicle accident or even a medical call. Fire chief's responsible for the development and enforcement and implementation of, policies and procedures. They're responsible to plan for, equipment, vehicle maintenance, and also replacement. Fire department training program, what are they training on? How often are they training on there? We talked about code enforcement, continuing education, attending conferences, meetings, because they need to stay current with what's happening in the fire service. Every day, there's always something new out there that affects the fire service. Human resources, probably one that maybe causes a lot of gray hair for a lot of fire chiefs or maybe a lot of lost hair, is human resources. They're responsible for the firefighters in their department, and firefighters are all great people, but, from time to time we see that, sometimes, there's discipline involved, which is always a tough thing to deal with within fire departments. But there's hiring of new firefighters, so recruitment, retention. Funding sources, looking at grants, it's the fire chief, that is ultimately responsible for all of this stuff that happens. They can designate other people within the department to, maybe take charge of this project, looking for grants. They might appoint somebody to go, all I want you to do is look at grants, but ultimately the bottom line is the fire chief is the one that's responsible for all of this stuff that happens there. So let's look at some fire department budgets, and what's all included in that. So one of the questions we always get from, a lot of people is, why are these fire department budgets so expensive? Providing fire service it's not cheap. Not only do the costs increase every year, but fire departments are seeing an increased need for services. And not saying that it's just, an increased medical response that they're seeing a need for, but, today's fire departments are responding to a lot more than just fires. There's medical services that they're responding to, hazmat incidences, confined space, grain bin rescues, vehicle or equipment accidents, water, ice rescue. Fire departments are kind of the Swiss Army knife of everything. So with the increased need for services, there's also an increased need that's placed on, personnel, increased need for equipment, and an increased need for training for all of the many layers of, things that fire departments are doing today. But every fire department's main concern should be about customer service, and doing what is best for Mrs. Smith when she calls 911. So some of the things that are included in the fire department's budget, looking at personnel, this can make up the vast majority, of the fire department's budget, depending on how much their wages are or if there's any wages at all. Physicals, most fire departments require their firefighters to get a yearly physical. Benefits, this can range from, their retirement pensions, there's some fire departments out there that one of the benefits they give to their firefighters is a gym membership, to promote some physical wellness. Administrative expenses, again, they're not incurred directly by the fire department, but rather indirectly through their governing body, such as the audits, maybe there's some legal services involved. Training, every fire department's going to have a training budget. What that budget is all going to depend on what their training requirements are. And those requirements are going to be based on, the type of services that they're providing, and some of those may be required by OSHA or the NFPA, or the Emergency Medical Services Regulatory Board if they're doing medical response. There are funds that are available through the Minnesota Board of Firefighter Training and Education to reimburse fire departments for all or maybe a portion of their training expenses. Those funds fluctuate from year to year, but the main thing is that all the fire departments in the state have that reimbursement training money available to them to use. Looking at insurance, workers' comp, liability, equipment, apparatus insurance, these are all typically covered through the fire department's governing body. So that might be through the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust, that might be through the Minnesota Association of Townships Insurance Trust, and they can even reach out to, private companies can provide that coverage. And those rates are going to vary depending on, what type of coverage they select, as well as, the number of firefighters that are on the department, what type of equipment, and the age and all that stuff. Utilities, that kind of goes without saying, everyone has those utilities, electric, water, phone. Equipment maintenance. So, looking at that specialized equipment, some of that requires yearly maintenance. So every fire department's going to have some of that specialized equipment that requires, some sort of periodic or annual maintenance and testing. And some of those maintenance and testing requirements are required by the NFPA, and some of those are made mandatory by OSHA through their general duty clause. Equipment replacement, let's face it, nothing lasts forever. At some point, there's no more parts available for this stuff. The manufacturers don't support it anymore, and it needs to be replaced at some point. And unfortunately, some of this equipment can be very, very expensive. Are there grants available for this equipment? Yeah, sure there are. However, the thing to remember is that there's no guarantee with a grant. Just because you applied for it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get that grant. So making sure that some of this stuff is in your budget, it's going to ensure that there's going to be money there to replace it when the times come, when the time comes, if you can't secure a grant. And if you are lucky enough to get a grant, you can then use those funds that have been budgeted for this, to maybe supplement some other items within the budget, such as, turnout gear. Again, we talked about how, NFPA and OSHA require that replacement every 10 years from the date of manufacture. So I think the majority of the fire departments, will rotate this gear out over time, so they're buying, 2, 3, 4, 5 sets of gear every year. And then there's fire departments that do the entire turnout gear inventory every 10 years. It's just, they do the whole set all in one shot. Apparatus, so there's fuel repairs, maintenance, yearly pump service and testing, and a lot of that stuff can be expensive also, especially when it comes to the replacement of apparatus. So looking at replacement of apparatus, are we looking at brand new apparatus, or are we looking at used apparatus? You know, new can definitely cost you more upfront. You know, however, your longevity is maximized. You know, if you buy a new apparatus, you know, you can keep that apparatus and not have to worry about replacing it for, you know, 15, 20, 25 years, or however, you know, what the service life is within your department there. You know, looking at used, yeah, that can be cheaper up front. You know, some of the downsides that we've heard from departments looking for a used apparatus is that, you know what, it doesn't fit in our station. We can't find one that'll fit in a 10-foot door, and we've only got, you know, 25 foot of a bay. You know, we got to find something shorter, you know, in length and shorter in height to fit into our station there. So again, you know, there's pros and cons of new versus used. And looking at the fire station, since we talked about that a little bit, you know, there's always repairs and maintenance for every fire station, you know, and again, not everything lasts forever, and buildings need to be replaced from time to time or remodeled from time to time. You know, in some cases, you know, the building is in really good shape, but the fire department simply outgrown the building. You know, again, fire apparatus, you know, the trucks are not getting any smaller. You know, and with fire departments being asked to do more with more equipment, kind of means they need more space for this equipment. You know, but again, at the local level, you know, you'll have to weigh the pros and cons of, you know, doing a full replacement with a brand new building, or is there a way that you can remodel the building, the current building, to configure it, you know, in a more usable way, or, you know, maybe we're looking at a remodel and an addition, or maybe just an addition to help give more space, you know, that's more suitable for the fire department and the community. So looking a little bit at fire contracts, you know, one of the things we always encourage, you know, is asking questions, you know, but what questions should townships ask of the fire departments? You know, number one is, what services do you provide? You know, so when we look at fire protection, you know, are the fire departments, you know, structure protection, and specifically, are they doing interior firefighting, or is it just exterior firefighting? You know, are they able to do grass, wildland, forest firefighting? Vehicle and equipment fires, are they able to handle those things? You know, other services, you know, do you provide any medical services? You know, are they doing first responders? Do they have EMTs on staff? Any paramedics? You know, are they doing patient transport? You know, and maybe if not, if they're not doing patient transport, who's providing that service for the community? Hazmat, you know, technical rescue, vehicle equipment extrication, you know, are they able to do search and rescue, confined space, you know, water, ice rescue, you know, but the big thing here is, you know, overall together, the townships and the fire department should be looking at what hazards exist within the township. And together they should determine what services are needed, you know, what should be provided to protect the life and property, you know, of the residents within that township. You know, what's your response time to our township? You know, response time can be a very, very critical factor, and oftentimes can't be measured, you know, in terms of money. You know, making sure the fire department that you're looking at to contract with, you know, do they have mutual aid agreements with other fire departments to bring, you know, more resources to the scene quicker? You know, mutual aid again can be another critical factor. You know, and there may be other questions that are maybe more specific to your township. You know, so feel free to communicate what those questions are with your local fire chief. You know, and keep in mind that, you know, it may take some time to gather that data. You know, we're sure that they have it, you know, but maybe they haven't looked at it from that angle, you know, or from your approach yet. You know, so keep in mind, it may take them a little bit of time to gather that data. You know, so again, it may be best to meet well before your fire protection contract is due to ask some of those questions to make sure that you give the fire chief, you know, enough time to gather that data and get that information back to you. But again, you know, every decision that we make, you know, should be about what is best for Mrs. Smith when she calls 911. And so just to wrap this up, there's a lot of guiding principles for fire departments, looking at NFPA, OSHA, so we covered a lot of the correlation between NFPA and OSHA, and how some federal state laws impact fire departments. We discussed fire department leadership, and the local fire chief is, what may be included in fire department's budgets. And, we also looked briefly, at some of the questions that, township board members, can ask, when it comes to their fire protection contracts. And so with that, I will stand for any questions if anybody has any.
Hey, thanks so much, Jared. This is Leslie Rosedal, the meeting host. We've got 6 questions in the Q&A section. Are you able to find those? And
yeah, let me
okay.
Figure out how to blow this.
While you're maneuvering that, I'd encourage people to any participants. We've got 226 people that have joined us right now, which is great, you guys. Go ahead and put any questions in the Q&A part on the bottom of your screen. If you hover over it, you should see that. So
what happened here?
do you want me to read them off? Would that be
Yeah,
helpful?
because I'm
Okay.
not finding the right screen back here to get.
That's okay, no problem. So Sue writes, if the fire department has persons or volunteers that probably medically should not be on the fire department, what should be done by supervisors to correct the problem?
That's a really good question. So somewhere the fire department should have a job description for their firefighters. And so that kind of turns back into an HR thing. So, if hopefully the fire department has an HR policy for how they deal with, somebody that doesn't meet the minimum qualifications. But again, working with, the governing body concerning that. That can be a sticky situation. Nobody wants to, especially volunteer departments, we don't want to kick anybody out the department. But again, having a firefighter job description, and what are firefighters expected to do for their job, whether that's climbing ladders, carrying 50 pounds, some of those things, but making sure that they can meet those job requirements. And if they can't, what is the process to remedy that? So I would encourage, see if the fire department has that job description, and find out what their policy is for dealing with those issues.
Okay, hey, thanks. Next question is from Jim Fisher. He writes, we know that NFPA rules for equipment are basically for city departments who use their equipment daily, where volunteer departments may use theirs twice a year. How can equipment wear out when not in use? Aluminum air tanks are the same, which wears out on them. I use 100-ton aluminum jacks in the mine. They never wore out, and you can lift them with one hand. Vendors control the NFPA rules. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I did find the question, the Q&A box here.
So. Oh, good. Okay.
I was looking in the wrong spot. Thanks for that question, Jim. Yeah, NFPA rules unfortunately apply to every fire department. And there are committee members on the NFPA committees that come from volunteer fire departments. Equipment wear out when not in use, looking at aluminum air tanks, the aluminum air tanks, as long as they are fully aluminum, there is no service life on those as long as they can pass a hydrostatic test. The department can continue to use them as long as they pass the hydrostatic test. Some of the newer SCBAs, you can get what's called a carbon fiber bottle that has a 15-year lifespan on it. So after 15 years, they need to be replaced. With vendors controlling the NFPA rules, I see the frustration there. But, when you go in and you look at who is on those committees, there is not a single committee where it is 100% vendors that are on the committee. So there's always somebody from the fire service, chiefs, firefighters, that are involved in that. And that's set up specifically that way. So the NFPA knows, that they're not going to get inundated with, one side or the other taking over a standard and developing, the standard to their liking. Let's see here.
We've got about 9 questions if you want to do a quick rapid round, Jared.
Yeah, let's see here. I lost where Fisher was at here.
No, I answered his question, so I put him in the answered section. So
okay,
the
so
open one.
will our local fire department be able to reveal their PPC score if asked? Yeah, they should be able to share that with you. There's a lot of departments that are quite proud of their ISO rating. So sure, they can surely do that. Do any Minnesota townships have their own fire department? Yes. Unsure of the exact number of that, but that's information that we can certainly get for you if you're interested in that number. But yes, there are townships that own their own fire department. Our volunteer fire department has a limited budget for PPE. We depended on grants or on bigger departments who got all new gear and discarded their old gear, even in good shape. How can we get the word out that we are open to receiving recycled PPE that is not damaged and will put it to good use? From Duxbury Volunteer Fire Department in Pine County. Paul, am going to make a note. I will have our fire service specialist that covers that area reach out to you and find out, what exactly you're needing, and we will get the word out to see if there's some departments out there that are, looking at replacing some gear, and we'll get you hooked up with that. Okay. Where can you access state fire codes? The state fire code is available on the State Fire Marshal Division website. And so I think you can still see the website address up there, but sfm.dps.mn.gov. Can you talk a little bit about state aid that fire departments receive and how that money can be used within the fire department and towards the budget? Sure. So the state fire aid, it's in state statute that, typically that state fire aid is given to municipalities. And within 30 days, it needs to be turned over to the fire department's relief association if they have one. If the fire department does not have a relief association, the city can then use that money for specific things for the fire department. So there's certain types of equipment, things that they can use, but it has to be spent towards the fire department. And again, as long as they don't have, that relief association. And, we can certainly, you have to look in that statute to get specific on where that money can be spent and what it can be spent on for the fire department, but it is covered in statute. Let's see, next one, PowerPoint be available? Sure. Yeah, I can definitely put PowerPoint together as a PDF, and I probably will email that to either Leslie or Scott from Matt, and they can post that on their website too.
That's perfect. We'll do that. Thank you, Jared.
And then the state has private fire brigades. Does the fire chief still have authority to enforce codes in violation, or does that have to be resolution by the township board? So I'm going to assume, as a private fire department, you have that contract with the township, and same thing, state fire code is going to fall back to the local fire chief that has, the authority having jurisdiction with that contract. So, if the township decides, that in their contract that they don't want the fire chief to do that job, they can designate somebody else to do that.
Great. Well, thank you, Jared. I think we've gotten through all of our question and answers. Oh, we've got one more, I think, in the chat here. Says, can you use fire relief aid for equipment even if you have a relief association?
No,
Okay.
It has to go to the relief association.
Great. Well, thank you, Jared, for your time and your presentation, and we'll certainly get that up online on the township website. Yeah, this was really great information. So thank you
Perfect.
again, Jared.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you to Matt for the opportunity to share some information on fire service in Minnesota. And thank you for everyone for the opportunity of your time today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Well, now it's 12 noon.